Okay, good evening, maybe good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome one more time to a webinar as part of the Innovation and Precision Eye Health webinar series for 2024. My name is Raymond. I'm assistant professor in the Department of Ophthalmology at the National University of Singapore and at the Singapore Eye Research Institute. And today we are very privileged to have as speaker Professor Saw Seang Mei, who is a distinguished Wallace Fold professor at Duke NUS Medical School and the co-head of the Myopia department at the Singapore Eye Research Institute. Prof Saw is also a professor at Saw Seang School of Public Health at NUS. I'll do a brief introduction about Prof Saw, about her background, and I promise to be short because we have a lot to learn today from Prof Saw's lecture. So Prof Saw received her MBBS in medical degree from NUS and MPH and PhD from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in the US. Prof Saw's work has been instrumental in building our current understanding of environmental and genetic influences in myopia. She pioneered large-scale longitudinal myopia studies, for example, SCORM, but also the myopia portion of GUSTO. She developed devices for myopia, like a fitness tracker called FitSight for myopia prevention, but also novel contact lenses to slow myopia progression. For those who work in the myopia field, I think Prof Saw doesn't need all this introduction. Everybody would know her. Prof Saw has an H index, which is a marker of how prolific she is in science, of 135. She has over 35,000 citations and over 597 international papers, including some in very high impact journal like Lancet, Nature Genetics, and JAMA. Prof Saw's accolades include the President's Science Award in Singapore in 2019, the Chu Sek Jin Memorial Lecture in 2013, and she is part of the top 100 ophthalmologist power list. So without further ado, Prof Saw, it's a privilege to have you with us. Thanks again for being here. As you know, you will present to us some of your recent work, and then at the end we will have a discussion. I have Dr. Soon Chen Singh from NUH and NUS Ophthalmology who will be joining, and Dr. Janice Lam as well from NUH and NUS Ophthalmology who will be joining us for an exciting discussion at the end. So the title of Prof Saw's lecture for today is Outdoors, Light and Myopia in Children. Prof Saw, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all your time, and thank you for joining us. I'm just going to say that was a very generous introduction, Raymond, and it's a great privilege to speak here today. I'm going to speak on one of my favorite topics, light, outdoor, and myopia, and how it affects children. So without further ado, I'm going to start with my financial disclosures. And I do not think I've got any other financial disclosures related to this talk except what's on the slide. As we know, myopia is a huge public health problem because of the high rates worldwide. Many would say that myopia is now a disease. It's not just a disorder. And, the many WHO workshops, because you see here in this photograph, there's this burden, complications in the retina and macula. So it's not just, what many people thought many decades ago, that it's just a benign ocular disease. And as we know, the rates are much higher in Asian urban cities. Singapore is one of them. It's considered one of the, myopia capitals of the world. And it's also high in big cities in China, in big cities in Japan, in Korea, Taiwan, and in Hong Kong. And here I'm just going to show some of the data from the Singapore military. It's very interesting because military service is compulsory for males in Singapore. It's called national service, and the young men are about 16 to 25 years. And even as far back as 1996, we refracted a very large number, about 15,000 young males. and found that the rates of myopia in Singapore are highest in the Chinese, lower in Malays and Indians. Among Singapore Chinese in 1996, and that's about 30 years ago, the rate of myopia was 82%. And it's not like, in the past 10 years. And now, or 10 years ago, it's about 86% when we refracted all 20,000 again. And I think this is an important landmark study showing that Singapore is one of the first few countries with a high myopia rate, and many other countries will follow what's happening in Singapore, because Singapore, we see these trends, and these trends have been present for a very long time, for about 30 years. And we wrote an editorial. It says here, Mark Bullimore, as far as the eye can see, the importance of myopia is a pressing public health need. And here it summarized why is myopia now a disease and a pressing public health need. Firstly, because we know the prevalence is high. It's increasing worldwide, and I'm going to talk about it in the next few slides. Secondly, we know about the burden. The burden and the risk of disease, myopic macular degeneration, is much better defined now by many experts worldwide. And only in the past 10 to 15 years, new treatments proven in randomized controlled trials, and some of these treatments approved by the FDA and many other regulatory authorities in different countries worldwide, have been shown to slow the progression of myopia. So the landscape for myopia treatment is very different now. So let's talk about these secular trends. In Asia, the secular trend started some time ago. We see that even before World War II in Japan, from 1912 to 1937, we see these increases, and increases just kept on going until the rates were much higher. And I'd like to illustrate what's happening in Singapore. We had increases from 1920s to the 1960s, from 30% to 50%. So a gradual increase as expected. But there was an exponential jump of prevalence from about 50% to about 80%, as I've shown you. And this jump was in 20 to 30 years. And I've tried to correlate that with the change in the education system. Because around that time, our country gained independence. And after our country gained independence, there was a new government, and the education system was different. And we had to drive the economy. So with that change in the education system, we see an exponential rise. It is still high, but it is quite stable in Singapore. So it has been high for about the past 30 years. Another different problem that we have in a country such as Singapore, and we will see it in the other urban Asian cities, such as China, big cities in Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, is that we see a difference in the myopia rates. So are the myopia rates 80% in ADOs in Singapore? They are not. They are much lower. So in the SEED study of 10,000 adults, the rates of myopia in the elderly are only about 36%. And that reflects the previous graph where the lifestyle has changed dramatically, and that's why the rates are much higher now at 80%. But not in the elderly, where the school and the schooling system and education system was much different. And I've shown this before, I published this and I reviewed this, but this tells us what is going to happen in the future. I'm not talking about secular trends. Even if we controlled the myopia rates and they did not rise, even if the myopia rates fell in every single country, we cannot stop the fact that myopia is a lifetime disease, and the young people in these countries such as Singapore have very high rates of myopia, 80%. Once myopic, they're always myopic. So they're growing older and older. They're going to be 50, 60, 70, 80 years in the next few decades. 80% of our elderly will have myopia. And we see that the rates of high myopia will also rise, 6% to 15% in the elderly. And then the pathologic myopia rates now are low because the myopia rates are low. But this will not remain, because pathologic myopia is also an age-related disease and will also rise to about 10%. So this is what's going to happen in the future. We can't stop this, because myopia never regresses. So we have suggested a three-pronged approach for some time, and this is based on the epidemiologic principles of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. The first solution is to prevent myopia from occurring. That is primary prevention. The second is secondary prevention, where we have early detection and treatment of children with disease, children who have myopia. Thirdly is what we call tertiary prevention. We want to prevent the severity of disease, worsening of the disease, and complications of the disease. So let's look at primary prevention, preventing myopia from occurring. And so we know that like many eye diseases, there are both environmental factors and genetic factors. There's a combination of both, but many people think that environmental factors are important because of the rising rates, and the gene pool in these populations have not changed very much. And many articles and papers have been published on the different environmental factors, like are you the firstborn, your height, diet, sleep, and so forth. But many of these risk factors eventually point to only two. So if we only know two environmental risk factors, we are not wrong, because we may only need to know two, where there's a large body of evidence. The first is the lack of outdoor time. The second, which is too much near work, too much reading, writing, or screen time. There are only two important environmental factors. Which environmental factor can we modify? Outdoor time. And that's why that is the topic of my talk today, because I think that's really important to change behavior and prevent the onset of myopia. Before I illustrate the effect of outdoor time, I'm just going to summarize some of the risk factors such as near work. So we know that screen time is a real problem now, the computer games, there's gaming, and even the share market, the shares drop for, the gaming companies. And the Chinese government has stepped in and restricted the hours for gaming and so forth. So, screen time is really a huge problem. And gaming and computer games for leisure is becoming really very popular nowadays, especially amongst youngsters. And we have performed the systematic review with a forest plot, and we see here again that the studies have shown a mixed evidence, but recent studies on screen time and myopia in large populations have shown an increased risk of myopia with increased screen time. What about the genes for myopia? So it is not true that myopia is not genetic. Myopia is genetic as well, because based on GWAS studies, and we were actively participating in the CREAM consortia, involving here, as illustrated, 50,000 adults from 25 European studies and 9 Asian studies. There have been several GWAS studies that have identified SNPs or small minor genes for myopia. But there is no major gene for myopia. So unlike age-related macular degeneration, where there is a major gene for AMD, there is no major gene for myopia, but many small little genes for myopia. Okay, so I'm going to talk about outdoor time, and it's such an important risk factor. Evidence is from the highest level of evidence, from gold standard studies called randomized double-mask controlled trials. And these trials are huge, involving many school children, thousands of them. The intervention is outdoor, maybe an extra hour every day. And we see here over the 3 to 4 year period that the incidence rate of myopia decreased. And this evidence or these results were replicated again and again in several randomized controlled trials. So we have really good evidence for outdoor time and how it can prevent myopia onset. Then I'm just gonna, diverge a little bit and talk about the impact of spending too much outdoor time on school academic results, because parents will always say that, the children are very busy with homework. They can't spend too much time outdoors because they spend even less time doing their schoolwork. But in the STORM study of 3,291 children, they found that outdoor time was associated with better academic performance. And this is not surprising considering that it does improve mental health and elevate stress as well. This is another study in Shanghai, 6,000 children, and they were aged 6 to 9 years. There were 2 interventions, either an additional 40 minutes or additional 80 minutes of outdoor time. And we found again that the cumulative incidence of myopia was lower once there was an outdoor intervention, and they were wearing a light meter. So they found that if they were exposed to higher light levels, the risk of myopia decreased as well. I like to illustrate this story with our SCORM cohort. This is now a 25-year-old cohort, and we're proud of it because it was the second cohort in the world and the first cohort of myopia in Asia. At that time, we recruited 1,979 children from 3 primary schools, documenting the high rates of myopia even in young children then. In 12-year-olds, it was already 63%. And this was 25 years ago. And here, this important comparative study with my collaborators in Australia, Ian Morgan and Kathy Rose, which was published way back in 2008, already demonstrated that outdoor time was the main risk factor. We found very high rates of myopia in Singapore Chinese children aged 7, 29%. Compared that to Sydney Chinese children of the same age with only 3%. We gave them the same questionnaires, but actually even expecting the Singapore Chinese children to do more near work, but the Sydney Chinese children were reading more books per week outside school. And to our surprise, we found such a huge difference in the time outdoors. The Sydney Chinese children were really spending time outside of school, 13 hours a week, compared to the Singapore Chinese children. So this was the first suggestion, and then proven again in a SCORM study where we see the odds ratio of 0.9, p-value of 0.004, and the confidence interval, which is less than 1, suggesting that outdoor activity was protective for myopia. This is another study we started when we started SCORM. We started a parallel cohort, a 6-year cohort in Xiamen in the southern part of China with Professor Zhang Mingzi. And it was in the city and the countryside. And again, at that time, the education system in China was different. They spent a lot more time outdoors. And in the countryside, much lower rates of myopia than in Xiamen city. So why is outdoor time protective for myopia? One hypothesis is that the light levels are higher outside, and this is documented again and again. I will show you this data. And the high light levels release dopamine, which is a retinal neurotransmitter that acts as a stimulator of choroidal thickness and scleral remodeling, preventing eye elongation. Another hypothesis could be either red light or blue light, which may be protective, but the evidence is mixed depending on the animal experiments and which species. And then another is based on far viewing and whether the periphery is clearer and dioptric values outside. And we do see that there might be a few reasons why outdoor may be protective. We have invented a fitness tracker in 2014, about 10 years ago. And this was linked to an app. And this fitness tracker documents the amount of time outdoors in the day. And it's minute by minute. And the parents and children can look at that to find out the amount of time in minutes per day that the child spends. At the same time, we're using lux, we're measuring the lux levels. And this can be used in research as well. And I show you some of the data. When we use this fitness tracker to measure the data in lux, and we see that when you match that to a diary, this is a typical child, we see the huge contrast in the lux level. So again, this proves when you're indoors, the lux levels are very low. They're only about 200 to 100 lux. So very low levels. And when the child's in school the entire time, there's only one time during recess in Singapore where the child's outside, and that rises to about 26,000 lux. It's not that high as in other countries because it is a cloudy sky in Singapore. And we measured that many times. We've got many clouds, but that's high enough to protect for myopia. But we noticed that this is a very typical Singapore child. Singapore child spends a lot of time indoors because just walking back home and the rest of the time, the Singapore child is in his house or his cousin's house with very low light exposures, very low lux levels. And this sort of lifestyle now is very different from 50 to 70 years ago, where children were outdoors and exposed to much higher levels of lux. So I was the founder, principal investigator, and I initiated this birth cohort in Singapore from the two major maternity hospitals, NUH and KK Hospital. And now the children are about 15 years of age. And this birth cohort originally was designed to look at epigenetics from the cord and cord blood and the effect on obesity. But we also have very good myopia measures at the age of 3, 6, and 9. We perform cycloplegic refraction and use the IO master to measure axial length. And then we had 3 measures of outdoor from a questionnaire, the WHO risk factor questionnaire, from a diary. We asked the children to complete a diary and indicate what they're doing, and for every outdoor activity, exactly what they were doing. And they wore the tracker for a week. So we've got that data as well. So from the diary, the children were, spending quite a lot of time outside. They weren't that sedentary, but they were not that active as well. So what were 9-year-old children doing when they were outdoors? They were either walking or strolling, or they were playing in the neighborhood. Some of them were swimming because it's a tropical country, and a few of them were playing ball games. And the question about, reading when you're outside, very few children like doing that. So it's only 2.3%. Rest of the time, they're traveling in the bus or traveling in the car. And we see here also when we're at the light levels and how they change over the day. So we have it minute by minute, hour by hour. The light levels and exposure in the middle of the day, light levels were higher, but the time that the child spent outside too was higher in the midday. What about weekday versus weekend? That's important in terms of outdoor programs designed for children. Because the question is, should we add outdoor programs when the children are in school? Or should we add outdoor programs which are family-based on weekends? I think both are important, but we see here that children spend more time outdoors on weekends. They have a lot more time to spend outside. The exposure to lux and light levels increase as well on the weekend. So there's a lot we can do for children on the weekend. And for family and parents, they prefer to bring their children outside on the weekends. They're busy working on the weekday. So we looked at the different effects, for example, the spurts, the light levels, and the patterns and so forth. But I would say the answer is duration, duration, duration. Because at the end of the day, if a child spends more time outdoors, the risk of myopia decrease, no matter how the child spent it, whether it was in 2 spurts, 3 spurts, at 20,000 lux, 5,000 lux, or whether it was a weekday, weekend, every day, or once in 3 days, if a child spent more time outdoors, no matter how the child did it, the child's risk of myopia was lower than a child who spent less time outdoors. So if you spend very little time outdoors, but you did it in a certain way, it's not going to help you very much. You just need to spend more time outdoors. And what was really important from our study was that we found that the children who were outside, and very often when we measure the light levels outside, the light levels are not very high because sometimes the children are in the shade, they're under the tree, they're in the courtyard, they're in the balcony, they're in the patio, they're in the sheltered walkway, they're not exactly directly under the sun. And here we see that most of the time the children are exposed to lower lux levels of 1 to 3,000 lux or 3,000 to 5,000 lux. And these lux levels are considered low outside. When at noontime on a cloudy day, it's 20,000. And in countries such as Australia, it's about 100,000 to 200,000 lux. And yet, these lux levels and time spent outdoors was protective. So children do not really need very high levels of lux. They just need to be outside rather than inside. And it's very telling because the previous graph showed that when you're inside, it's only 200 to 300 lux. We did compare our data with the data in Brisbane. So with Scott Reed, he also measured the lux levels. And we see here the number and duration of outdoor spurts is higher in the Brisbane children than in Singapore children. And across the day, the time outdoors, as well as the lux levels, were consistently higher in Australian children of the same age and Singapore children. So these data, and we know the myopia rates are much lower in Brisbane children. So what about the surrounding, the environment? So we see here this data from a huge study in China, and the ability to extract the green space, and they had these satellite images, and they classified the green space based on what they call a myopia-related green space morphology index, and it showed that for each student, if that green space index increased, there was a reduction in the risk of instant myopia. The p-value was less than 0.001. This is an interesting study of that novel classroom in Guangzhou that was built in Yangtze. It's called the Bright Classroom. It was built some time ago, and all the walls and the roof were made of glass, and it was all clear glass. And when the light intensity inside the Bright Classroom was measured, it was much higher than a normal classroom. So a normal classroom is only about 200 to 300 lux, but here in this Bright Classroom, it is about 2,500 lux, whereas outside it might be higher, but in the traditional classroom, when they measured it, it was 477 lux. But can we build these classrooms throughout the country? I think the major drawback would be cost, because it is expensive to build these classrooms. I'll now like to talk about how if a child already has a disease, if the child is already myopic, then do we just leave the child alone? Or should we prevent the child from developing severe myopia or high myopia by slowing the progression of myopia? And what is the role of outdoors? So once a child is myopic, and I'll show you some of this data across visits 1, 4, and 6, we see that shift in myopia. Things are not static in children. We see that refraction status is changing rapidly over time. If we look at these histograms, the more and more children who are myopic, we see the shape of the graphs. They're changing, they're becoming bimodal. All the children are shifting towards myopia and high myopia. It is a very dynamic state. And if you look at axial length and Richards chamber depth, and here in the SCOM study between the ages of 6 to 13, again, if they're really myopic, the green line, persistent myopes, myopia will continue to progress. There is no such thing as regression or myopia being static. And then we've got those who are ametropic at the beginning of the study. Again, so many of them develop myopia as they cross the line, and then the rest of them were ametropes and hyperopes. You see these changes again reflected in the anterior chamber depth, and we also documented corneal curvature. There wasn't much change, and the lens thickness as well. So how can we treat? And there have been many new treatments. I'll say that low-dose atropine eye drops has been around for a long time. We did summarize that some time ago. At that time, only atropine eye drops worked, and that was 20 years ago. And then now we have evidence, for example, very dilute concentrations of atropine, 0.05%, are efficacious enough to slow the progression of myopia, and yet the side effects are tolerated. So atropine eye drops are proven again and again to effectively slow the progression of myopia. But now there have been many other suggested treatments, whether the spectacles with the DIMS technology or XLR spectacles or HALT technology. We've got soft contact lenses with the myopic defocus technology, repeated low-level red light therapy that has been shown to be very effective, caffeine tablets, 7-methylxanthine tablets, all outdoor. So should we, ask the children to go outdoors, or should we just ignore environmental behavioral treatment changes? The evidence for outdoor time to slow the progression of myopia is not strong. Okay, it is not strong as compared to outdoor time and myopia onset. So we look at this very recent, published in January 2024, systematic review, and we see here again that there is a trend. It favors a high exposure of outdoor, but it is still not statistically significant. But since we see a trend, I think it is still beneficial to ask the children to go outdoors, whether it's a school program, a community program, or using a tracker. And here I'll say here, in a myopic clinic, whether it's in an eye hospital or eye care practitioner's clinic, we see a child with a high risk of myopia based on stratification, and we can predict who has a high risk of myopia. And then we should come in and treat these children to prevent high myopia and the complications, whether it's with atropine or with any of the new spectacles or contact lenses, or whether it's with red light therapy. But we must consider how much outdoor time the child is going to be engaged in. The reason for that is that there is some evidence that more outdoor time may slow the progression of myopia. There's some evidence. Therefore, there's also some evidence that if the child spends more time indoors, the progression of myopia may be faster. So why would the parent or child spend money, time, comply with the treatment that works, and yet the child doesn't go outside? Because that indoor habit may even negate the effect of the treatment. So it will be wise for eye doctors and eye care practitioners to advise the children, especially high-risk children, high risk of high myopia and pathologic myopia, to spend more time outdoors as well. So there is a role for outdoors, especially when the child is treated, to slow the progression of myopia. Okay, I'm going to talk about this interesting study. It's one of my favorite studies because it's so different. We invented this mannequin to examine sunglasses and hats and their effect. And we did this in Singapore, and this is a Singapore sky. We placed this mannequin in different environments in the open field. This is a university. You can see the mannequin on the street, and then here in the shade under a tree. And then we placed the mannequin in the Singapore Eye Research Institute in the room with a big window, in the room without any windows. And we see the big contrast and difference between sunlight, which is natural, very high light levels, different chromaticity, versus indoor lighting, which is artificial, very different exposure for the children. So I'm going to talk about the effects of a tree. So we did place the mannequin at different times of the day, but it didn't really make much difference. And when the mannequin has a light sensor in the eye socket, so exactly at the right place. It measures the light levels in lux, and under a tree, as expected, it is lower than the 20,000 lux. It is about maybe 12,000 to 18,000 lux. So it's a bit lower, about 8,000 lux, compared to outside, about 8,000 lux. And it is still higher than indoors, where it's only a few hundred lux. And on the street, again, it varies depending on which part of the street, but it may be a bit lower than the open field, but much higher than indoors, which is only 200 to 300 lux. And then when we looked at the effect of sunglasses, so with the open field again, 16,000 to 18,000 lux, when the child is wearing sunglasses and we can measure the light entering into the eye, the lux levels were lower, 2,000 to 3,000 lux, but they were still higher than indoors, And we know children already do not spend much time outside at high lux levels, most of the time at 2,000 to 3,000 lux. And what about the effect of a hat? Does it prevent high lux levels from reaching the eye? Not really, that's the red bar here. We see that the light levels are still quite high, 4,000 to 6,000 lux. And even if we walked around with a hat and sunglasses to protect ourselves against the UV light, it's still higher than 1,000 lux and still higher than indoors. So it would be acceptable for us to tell the parents to ask your child spend more time outdoors, even if it is under a tree or the eye is blocked by hat or sunglasses, the lux levels are still high enough to encourage the child spend more time outdoors, at least 2 to 3 hours per day, or at least 14 to 21 hours per week. We have had many programs, and here we work very closely with NParks and Nature Society, and we brought the family and the siblings of children in our study. It's a randomized trial. We went to many different parks in Singapore. For those of you in Singapore, I've been to parks in as far north as Sungai Buloh and Woodlands, and as far south as Labrador Park, and in the east and the west. And Singapore has many beautiful parks. And we found that the outdoor time increased. It increased by more than 3 hours per week, just because these excursions were organized for the children. There have been many moves to increase outdoor time in the schools and the preschools in Singapore, including this large childcare center in the public park in the northern part of Singapore. So I think this is a very good trend. And our Ministry of Health National Myopia Prevention Program, they've come up with this nice slogan for many years: keep myopia away, go outdoors and play. There's a nice song, a skit. And here are the children at Labrador Park enjoying themselves. So I do wish that children would just spend more time outdoors. I think that's the message for today. Wear your hat, wear your sunglasses, just spend more time outdoors, because it is about duration, duration, duration. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening in. Thank you today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Prof Saw. I think the floor is open for questions. We have a few questions already from our participants. Maybe I can ask the first one, which is, I think you addressed it a little bit, but there's a question: when children stay outdoors, should they wear sunglasses or not?
Yeah, I think they should wear sunglasses. You need to protect your eyes from UV light, because, if you do not, you may have an increased risk of other eye diseases later in life, such as cataract or age-related macular degeneration. And again, it shows that there's enough sunlight entering the eye, not the UV light, but light and lux, to prevent myopia.
Yeah, so maybe I can switch to our panelists. We have Dr. Janice Lam and Dr. Sun Chen Sing. Janice, Chen Sing, any questions for Prof Saw? So I know, Chen Sing, you worked on Gusto with Prof Saw. So now is your time to ask any burning questions you have.
Well, I think I have a potential conflict here because I work closely with Prof Saw for the Fit Sight watch. Well, Janice, I'll let you go first.
Hi, Prof Saw. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. Really, really interesting. And to see all the evidence summarized in that amount of time, it's amazing your work. And so many years have been put into it. Being a pediatric ophthalmologist, I think it's always commonplace that we get questions from parents about, outdoor time, the feasibility of it. Spending outdoors, considering like the high academic pursuits and demands on our children. So I can see that, from your slides, you mentioned about, these, there was a FIT program for some children, and to what aspect or to what extent are these programs being implemented by Health Promotion Board or into schools that can, in a way, elevate the burden from parents who otherwise feel like they're helpless in bringing their children outdoors due to the demands of school, of life?
Yeah, thank you, Janice. So that's a very good question, especially for the Singapore audience. And I think we have several factors here to consider, how busy the parents and children are. We are also a tropical climate, and it's advised that the children go outdoors early in the morning or in the evening. So we're sort of restrained a little bit by the weather. But I think these activities are important rather than to just leave the children, the parents, with their own, ideas on how to go outside, because they may not be able to sustain it for very long. So if they go to the same park or the same playground every week, after a while, the child may be a bit bored, and it's good to have a nice excursion once in a while. So I think we are moving to working towards that. Actually, we are thinking of working with a few NGOs to develop an outdoor program in the after-school centers in Singapore. And I think it does make a difference when we have an interesting excursion. And I must say that the parents actually liked that very much, even though it took up a lot of their time, and they had to travel to every park. It took up the whole afternoon for them. And another hidden reason for that was they thought that the children could learn a little bit about plants and animals as well. So they thought that they could learn a little bit about science, but every little bit helps. I say, why not? Why not learn about science when you're outside at the same time?
Mm. Great, thank you. I super agree with you, because when parents are kind of left to their own devices, it's quite difficult to be creative. And with these programs, I think it would also give them a systematic, a kind of approach, or kind of an activity, fun activity to spend with their family and incorporate, like you say, learning into spending outdoor. And with every Singaporean parent, is always like, how much more can they learn? How much more can they glean from this, right? Thanks so much, Prof. Chen Xin, do you have something to ask?
I will perhaps facilitate the Q&A sessions on the questions posted. So one of the questions the audience asked, and I know Prof Saw has an answer, is there any threshold level of minimum lux quantity to prevent myopia in terms of lux level?
Yeah, so I think the child needs to be outside, which is more than 1,000 lux, and we have done at least 2 or 3 experiments on that. It's between 1,000 and 1,500 lux. It is still much higher than indoors, because indoors is less than 500 lux. So even if you're next to a window or you have like 20 to 30 light bulbs in the room, it is less than 500 lux. So I think if the child is outside, and even it is partially blocked, but more outside and more than 1,000 to 1,500 lux, that would be good. I'd just like to let everyone know that you can measure the light levels for your children. You can buy the light meters from the shops and actually measure the light levels yourself.
Okay, can I chip in on this one as well, maybe to add, because I see Pavan has asked a question which is along the similar lines. And he's also asking, what is your opinion on the role of mesopic light levels in myopia prevention? And I would want to warn parents that not all lux meters are correct out there. You have devices that are incorrect and will give you wrong results. So I wouldn't jump yet to buying any lux meter you have. Just be careful. The devices we use in our studies, in Prof Saw studies, are highly calibrated. You may end up on a device that may not be calibrated. So just if you want to pick something, make sure you pick a good brand. We cannot advertise here. That's all.
Yeah,
So
I think just get your children outdoors.
exactly.
Yeah, you don't really, we have done all the measurements and all that. So as long as the outdoors, I think we do not really know what exactly really causes and prevents myopia besides the highlight levels, because that is very clear. It's much different. But the exact wavelength, whether it is, repeated red light, and red light seems to work, 3 minutes a day, and we have a certain, beam of red light, or is it the blue light, or is it cyan light? It is still unknown, and we're still investigating that. But we know that, the sun has got, very different wavelengths compared to artificial light.
Yeah.
So if we're exposed to the wavelengths from artificial light, then we're just stuck with that. We're just stuck with those wavelengths.
Yeah.
If we're not moving to what's happening naturally. Raymond, you can tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think we know that sunlight works in terms of intensity, in terms of spectrum. So the message is get the kids outdoors. Now, I think Prof Saw, Janice, and Chen Sing, and myself, we have a trial that's going to be running at schools in Singapore where we try to improve indoor lighting to mimic sunlight. So this is not similar to the Bright project. I know we have a question about the Bright classrooms next, where I'm going to ask it, but this is through improving the ceiling lights and making them similar to sunlight, but not in terms of these very high lux levels. We have a different approach in terms of spectrum. So what Prof Saw is saying is, we know sunlight works, just take the kids outside and let us work on what is the feature of light that is protective. But for now, we need to get the kids outdoors, I think. Just to go back to Pavan's question, maybe about mesopic light levels, Prof Saw, or do you think there's any role of mesopic light levels for myopia prevention?
Yeah, I haven't really been investigating that, in detail. So, I can't really say so much about mesopic light levels. Yeah, Raymond?
So, I mean, in terms of mesopic, it depends on, again, on the brightness, on the color content. But for now, in children, I don't think there's any evidence showing that mesopic will be protective compared to sunlight and compared to outdoors, compared to brighter light levels. As we play with the spectrum of light, the color content of light, we may get to lesser luminant light or reduced illuminance of light, but with tweaked spectrum. But we are not there yet, Prof. So I think we both align on this. Okay.
Maybe along the lines of this topic, there are two more questions audience ask about specific timing of bringing the kids outdoors. So someone asked, what about 4 to 6 p.m.? What's the light level around that time? Because that's the time when they end school after classes. Would that be enough? And then there's another one who asked, working parents, by the time they finish work is 6 p.m. 7 to 8 p.m. Is that too late? Prof. Saw,
thanks. A very good question. I think the light levels do not have to be high. From what we see here, they're quite low. So they're about 1,000 to 5,000 lux. And that may be because children are going outside when their parents are free. So maybe in the evenings or early in the mornings. But light levels are quite high throughout the day. And so even at 6 p.m. or even at 7 a.m., we see those light levels which are above 1,000 lux or above 1,500 lux. It may be 2,000 to 3,000 lux, but that's high enough. So it's good to bring your child outside as long as it's not nighttime or when it's dark, when the sun is not out and that's, you only have the moon. You just need to bring your child out. I think that's good enough. So we don't have to think that, we have to bring our child out, when it's 12 noon. And, during that time, we have to be aware that the heat can be quite hot in Singapore. So we have to be careful about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Ray, you have any?
Yes, I mean, if we can go back a little bit to the Bright classrooms, we have a question, Prof. Saw, maybe what were the light levels inside of these classrooms? Now, of course, this was a pilot, a proof of concept, basically, that these classrooms can be built. We don't have the data on them yet, unless I missed something, Prof. Saw, but do we know the illuminance inside of these classrooms?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it was about 3,000 lux. So it was higher than 1,000.
Got it.
But it was built where the roof and every single wall was made of glass. So there was no concrete or brick, and sunlight could stream in at every single angle except from the floor. So I think these classrooms are exceptional because I'm not sure whether they're really still indoors. The light can stream in 360 degrees and from the roof as well. Yeah, actually most probably outside. And these classrooms are very expensive and very difficult to build.
Yeah.
So you're mimicking the outside with the indoor classroom, but you actually more or less you're actually outside.
Yeah. Which takes us a little bit, Prof, to the implementation aspect of preventative ways for myopia. Because again, if a classroom is very difficult to build? Can it be implemented on a large scale? And the other thing about these classrooms, maybe, I don't know if they assessed the glare, because with 3,000 lux of sunlight, it would be tough for children to look at the whiteboard and without having any glare. So this is also one aspect that needs further investigations.
Yeah, there are a few things that need further investigation because
Right.
it's heat. So when
Okay.
there's glass, it's hotter.
Yeah.
And then
True.
there's more UV light going
Yeah.
through. So we have to be aware of that as well. And then there's glare. And so, it may be difficult, like you say, to read and write when sunlight is streaming in all the time.
Yeah.
And you can't sort of shut that out. So the children have no choice as well. So that's another thing you need to have, consent and agreement from all the parents and children in that classroom. And they might have to wear sunglasses and hat in class.
Okay, and Janice, question from your side?
Hi, so thanks, Prof Saw. So I know you mentioned about even sitting at the patio on a balcony, doing activities. There's also a lot more exposure to higher lux levels than being exactly indoors, right? And four-walled. So I think someone in the audience actually mentioned or asked whether reading outdoors under say like a shaded tree, is that still beneficial or does that negate the effects of the outdoor?
Yeah, so the two risk factors are coming together at the same time. I guess the question is that is reading outside better than reading inside? Well, too much reading is not good. So, I wouldn't advise a child to read that much because that causes myopia. Very few children read outside. From our diary, it's only 2 to 3%. Children don't like reading outside. When they're outside, they really like to look at
Play.
nature, look at the surroundings and play because there's so many opportunities outside. Not many children like it. We haven't really studied whether reading outside, which not many children like, is better than reading inside. Because in the first place, well, we do not think that, too much reading is a good thing for children.
To start off with.
But it might still be possible that if a child chooses to read outside instead of reading inside, the effect on myopia will be decreased. But there are very few studies looking at that.
Okay. So I suppose it's still, the frequent breaks doing near work tasks and reading is still beneficial. I think there are a lot of questions about sunglasses as well, about what type of sunglasses to use. Does wearing sunglasses or transition lenses actually kind of negate the effects? So I think one of the questions asked about transition lenses, and I kind of answered it separately, saying that you had mentioned in your talk that sunglasses does reduce like the outdoor lux levels entering the eye from 15,000 to about 2 to 3,000, but that's still a lot more than indoor lighting, right? So perhaps, Prof Saw, you could advise them about, the types of sunglasses or whether it has been exactly studied what type of sunglasses are more useful in these children.
Yeah, that's a very good practical question. We did study different types of sunglasses. We had class 2 sunglasses and class 3 sunglasses, but all the sunglasses that we studied allowed more light than if the child was indoors. So the answer would be that almost all sunglasses are good because there are no sunglasses that will block that much light that myopia cannot be prevented. So sunglasses will block the UV light, but they're unable to block the good effects of the high lux levels from the sun. So we do recommend all types of sunglasses. And for children to spend even more time outdoors, since they're wearing sunglasses, which are protective, and parents and children are comfortable with the sunglasses, can be transition, it could be wrap around, it could be class 2, class 3 sunglasses. Children should spend even more time outside since the eyes are protected against the UV light.
Sounds good. So no more excuses.
Okay, so perhaps another question from Pavan that I thought was interesting is Pavan would like to hear Prof Saw's thought on why the efficacy for outdoor is relatively less for controlling myopia progression compared to prevention.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Hi, Pavan. So glad to see you here. Pavan worked with me for several years, so he's a very close collaborator of mine. I think the normal eye is different from the myopic eye. So the effect of environmental factors on the normal eye, they are shown that high lux levels outdoor time can prevent the transition and development of myopia in a non-myopic eye. But in the eye which is already myopic, then the effects are not, I can't really say exactly in detail, but the effects of the sun and the high lux level and the outdoor time on an eye which is already myopic may be different. And here we're not preventing a change in the state of the eye, but we're saying that it can prevent the eye from getting worse. And thus the outcome is different and the state of the eye, because the eye is a myopic eye, is also different. And we see that effect is either minimal or less in a non-myopic eye.
If I may add to this as well, I think we need objective assessment of light, like what Prof Saw is doing in her studies, what we will be doing in our studies to better evaluate the effect of outdoors time on myopia prevention as well. So there are studies coming up about not prevention, but at least slowing the progression of myopia. So I think the combination of objective assessment and more studies coming on board with outdoor time, I think will help elucidate quite a bit of things when it comes to controlling myopia progression as well. So because I assume, Prof. Saw, that parents, do they usually overestimate or underestimate time spent outdoors in their children?
I think in Singapore, they spend so little time outdoors, I think they may overestimate it.
Overestimate it.
So yeah, it's so little. Sometimes it's only half an hour a day for some children.
Got it.
So there are three questions along the same lines. There's somebody asking, is there an age cutoff where this myopia protection from outdoor doesn't work anymore? Does it work from young adults? And another audience asking, for adults, does it matter? So I guess adults with progressive myopia, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question because you're going to the realm of myopia onset. Niche environmental factors will work throughout life, whatever the onset. So the analogy, because I'm an epidemiologist, is that, cigarette smoking and lung cancer, doesn't matter how old you are, can it still prevent it? And usually environmental factors, across the board, cigarette smoking and cataract, no matter how old you are, it might take 5 to 10 years before you develop cataract. It might be 40, 50, 60, or 70, but cigarette smoking will increase the risk of cataract. So same here, outdoor time can be protective at whatever age, whether you're 5, 10, 15, 20, or 25. The important question here is age, because if a child is very young and myopic, this is what we call early onset myopia. Myopia will progress for a longer time. A myopia stops when a child stops growing taller and may continue for a few more years after that. In our SCORM study, 3/4 of the children were stable, or the adults were stable when they're about 20-something years of age, but 1/4 continued to progress even though they were about 28 to 30 years of age. We see that long progression. So if you're myopic and very young, then you need to treat that. You need to prevent that progression. And outdoor can also prevent the onset. Outdoor can prevent the onset of late onset myopia, but that is less serious because you progress for a shorter time. So your final myopia may not be that severe. Outdoor time may protect against adult myopia. It still may. So if you're actively involved in sports, in university, as an adult, you're a national service in the military, and you're outdoors all the time, you may see the outdoor time is preventing the onset of myopia even as an adult, and you may remain ametropic. So always spend a lot of time outdoors, not just, as a young child. You may develop adult onset myopia as well. So always spend a lot of time outdoors, even as a young adult or even as a teenager. But it is even more crucial to prevent early onset myopia, and that extreme and severe myopia is very critical to prevent very young children from becoming myopic. So very young children must spend more time outdoors.
Okay, I think first I would like to apologize for those who are still asking questions and for the 10 questions that we still have. We're going to take one last one and conclude. I think we'll take the last one, which says a group of researchers from China developed outdoor scene classrooms to combat myopia. So these are the classrooms with the wallpapers mimicking outdoor scene. Do you think this is the way to go in the future, Prof Saw?
Yeah, I heard about that too. I was actually in Shanghai in June. I know about these outdoor scenes, and it could be about the periphery, and it could be about the color that you're looking at, and maybe you're looking a bit differently, a bit far. So it might not be about just the light levels and lux. It might be several different reasons why outdoors is good for you. So let's look at that. We'll keep an open mind. And we'll see whether, looking at the outdoor environment and whether it does help. Maybe future studies should be conducted, and it may be possible as well.
Okay, excellent. So we're reaching the end, but we still have 10 questions. So again, sorry for the participants who've asked these questions and we couldn't reply to them. Prof Saw, thanks a lot for being with us today. Thanks a lot for this very, very informative talk. Again, Chen Sing, Janice, thanks for being excellent panelists, and we look forward to the next talk, Prof Saw, and further studies on myopia, and thanks for pushing the field at a very high speed. So thanks again. So for everybody, we will see you again next month for one more session of the Innovation and Precision Eye Health webinar series, and the next session will be with Professor David McKee from Lions Eye Institute in Australia. It's on the 8th of October, 2024, 6:30 to 7:30 as usual. Prof Saw, thanks again for a fabulous talk today.